Welcome. In this presentation, we're going to talk about the relationship between truth and validity. One key point for this lesson is the relationship between truth, validity, and soundness. We're going to ask you a bunch of questions about this on the practice tests and on the weekly test. We're asking this because it's essential to get these relationships down. You need this to understand the purpose of the different tools we're going to be giving you. So let's start by talking about truth. In our vocabulary for this course, we talk about true and false statements and true and false arguments. Let's start with true statements. Statements can be true or false. This is pretty straightforward. Let me give you some examples. Here are some true statements. A dog is a type of animal. Kansas is located in the United States. The moon is not made of green cheese. If you know basic facts about science, geography, etc., you know these things are true. Here's some clearly false statements. A dog is a type of plant. Kansas does not have any wheat fields. And the moon does not orbit the Earth. Again, if you know anything about animal science, geography, and astronomy, you know that all those statements are false. True arguments are a little more complicated. We use the term true argument to refer to an argument with true premises and a true conclusion. I'm also going to use the word false argument to refer to an argument with at least one false premise or at least one false conclusion. So remember, an argument is a set of statements, some premises and a conclusion. A true argument is one where all of the premises are true and the conclusion is true. A false argument is one where at least one of them is false. Let me give you some examples. Here are a pair of true arguments. On one side, some ducks have wings, some birds have wings, therefore some birds are ducks. Now let's see, do some ducks have wings? Yes, most ducks have wings. Do some birds have wings? Yeah, most birds have wings. Are some birds ducks? Yeah, some of them are. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some of them are. So all those statements are true. All of the premises are true, the conclusion is true, it's a true argument. Now let's look at the other one. All dogs are animals, all beagles are dogs, all beagles are animals. Are those statements true? Yes, all of them are true. Are all dogs animals? Yeah, a dog is a type of animal. Are all beagles dogs? Yes, a beagle is a type of dog. Are all beagles animals? Yes. So, those arguments have all true statements. They are true arguments. Now here's some false arguments. Some ducks have wings. Some airplanes have wings. Therefore, some airplanes are ducks. Do some ducks have wings? Yes, most ducks have wings. Do some airplanes have wings? Yes, you're not going to get off the ground without wings. Are some airplanes ducks? No, airplanes are machines, ducks are animals. No airplanes are ducks. Okay. I'm talking about the animal. I'm sure there's some type of airplane out there that they call a duck, but you know what I mean. So, true premises but a false conclusion. One of the statements in this argument is false, that makes it a false argument. On the other side, all cats are animals. All beagles are cats, therefore all beagles are animals. Are all cats animals? Yes. Are all beagles cats? No, no beagles are cats. Beagles are a type of dog. Dogs and cats are different things. Are all beagles animals? Yes. So we've got a true conclusion, but we've got false premises in there. And that means, or at least that is, we have one false premise in there, and that makes it a false argument. Now, an important limitation here. Sometimes students will say to me, well, that's a valid statement. And I say, no. In formal logic, statements cannot be valid or invalid. Statements can be true or false. Statements cannot be valid or invalid. There's no such thing as a valid or invalid statement. Only arguments can be valid or invalid. So the reason for that is this. Validity and invalidity have to do with the form. And the form has to do with the relationship between the things in the different statements. You don't have an argument at all if you've only got one statement. Right? A statement is just a statement. Right? So in a sense, there's no argument form there. Validity or invalidity is determined by the argument form. A single statement is not an argument. It doesn't have an argument form, so it can't be valid or invalid. Here's one way of thinking of this. Asking whether a statement is valid or invalid is like asking, what does the color blue taste like? Or how much does the feeling of anger weigh? Or do sea turtles have complicated plots and strong characters? Or what is the average wavelength of the plot of Middlemarch? These questions have no answer. Suppose someone comes up and says, do sea turtles have complicated plots or strong characters? I'd say they're not movies or books. They aren't stories. They're animals. They have guts and skins and shells and things like that. They don't have plots and strong or characters. Or someone says, oh, you're reading Middlemarch. You know, I've been wondering. People talk about the plot of Middlemarch, and I wondered what its average wavelength is. Is it true that it has a very long wavelength? I'd say, no, it doesn't have a long wavelength. And the person would say, oh, so it has a short wavelength. And I'd say, no, it doesn't have a short wavelength. And the person would say, oh, so it's got a medium wavelength? And I'd say, no, it doesn't have a wavelength at all. Right? You can't talk about the wavelength of it because wavelength is a property of lights. Okay, so you can't talk about whether the plot of Middlemarch has a long, medium, or short wavelength. Right? That kind of property just doesn't apply to Middlemarch. In the same way, it doesn't make any sense to ask whether a statement is valid or invalid. Right? That's not a property that statements can have. So these are the possibilities. Arguments can be true or false, valid or invalid. Statements can be true or false. They are neither valid nor invalid. Asking whether they're valid is like asking whether the color blue tastes more like chicken or beef. Right? It just doesn't make any sense. And this brings us to our main question. What is the relationship between validity and truth? Actually, we can make this more specific. There's really two questions here. What is the relationship between valid arguments and true arguments? And what is the relationship between valid arguments and true statements? We can then break it down a little further. We can break down that second question into what is the relationship between valid arguments and true premises? And what is the relationship between valid arguments and true conclusions? Let's start with the one that has a simple answer. What is the relationship between valid arguments and true arguments? The answer is nothing. There is no relationship between valid arguments and true arguments. Valid arguments can be true, valid arguments can be false, invalid arguments can be true, invalid arguments can be false. Right? There is no relationship between the things. If you find out that a valid argument is valid, you don't know anything about whether it's true. If you find out that it's true, you don't know anything about whether it's valid. Same thing goes for invalidity, falsehood, etc. Let me give you some examples to illustrate this. Here's a couple of true arguments. One's invalid and one's valid. In fact, we've seen them before. Invalid argument. Some ducks have wings, some birds have wings, therefore some birds are ducks. Well, do some ducks have wings? Yes. Do some birds have wings? Yes. Are some birds ducks? Yes. All true. But it's not a valid argument. Why? Well, because there's instances of this argument that have true premises and a false conclusion. For example, some trees are in Manhattan. Some skyscrapers are in Manhattan. Therefore, some skyscrapers are trees. Well, no, it doesn't work like that. So it's possible to have an argument with this form that has true premises and a false conclusion. This one doesn't happen to. This happens to be a true argument. Right? But some instances of this form have true premises and a false conclusion, so it's invalid. So we have a true invalid argument. On the other side, we have a true valid argument. All dogs are animals, all beagles are dogs, therefore all beagles are animals. Is this valid? Yes, it is. Here's one way to think of it. It's basically saying, well, look, if something's a beagle, it's got to be a dog. And if something's a dog, it's got to be an animal. So if something's a beagle, then it has to be an animal. Or we could look at it like this. All beagles are animals. Well, is it possible to have an argument with this form that was so that the premises were true and the conclusion was false? Well, what if the conclusion were false? That would mean not all beagles are animals, or not all beagles are animals. Well, if not all beagles are animals and all beagles are dogs, right? Well, we've got something out there that's a beagle and it's not an animal. Okay? And if we said that all beagles are dogs, well, then that means we have something here that's a beagle, not an animal, and a dog. So we've got a dog that's not an animal. Don't worry too much about that. Later you're going to learn some tests for validity. The key point I want to emphasize here is that this is a valid argument and it's a true argument. Now let's look at a couple of false arguments. Some ducks have wings, some airplanes have wings, some airplanes are ducks. Now, we established earlier that this is an invalid argument form. I haven't changed the argument form in this slide. But this time it's a false argument. Do some ducks have wings? Yes. Do some airplanes have wings? Yes. Are some airplanes ducks? No. One of the statements in the argument is false. In this case, the conclusion is false. That makes the argument false. Now let's look at the other side. All cats are animals, all beagles are cats, therefore all beagles are animals. It's true that all cats are animals, so one of the premises is true. It's true that all beagles are animals, so the conclusion is true. But that other premise, all beagles are cats, is false. Beagles are a type of dogs, and no cats are dogs. Okay. So, again, we've got a false argument. But notice this time, it's a valid argument. It just happens to have a false premise. And that makes the argument false. Now, at this point, someone might say, well, wait a minute. Why can valid arguments be false? Or let's put this a little differently. Well, if we're talking about different categories of argument, right, and we're so interested in this category of validity, why would we be so interested in a category that includes some false arguments? That's a good question. The answer is this. An argument is valid if it has a valid argument form. An argument form is valid if absolutely no argument with this form has true premises and a false conclusion. This leaves open the possibility that some of its instances have true premises and a true conclusion, false premises and a true conclusion, or false premises and a false conclusion. We've ruled out one possibility, true premises and a false conclusion, but some of its instances could have any of the other possibilities. Now, why do we put things this way? Well, the general idea behind this is that validity is supposed to tell us whether the premises, if true, would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Nobody really cares what happens if the premises are false. If the premises are false, it's a bad argument. It doesn't prove anything. There's nothing to be concerned about. The real question is whether or not the premises, if true, would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Right? So we're not worried about what happens when the premises are false. At least when we're doing this step of figuring out whether or not an argument is valid, we don't care about what happens with that argument form when the premises are false. We're only concerned about the question of whether or not the premises, if true, would guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So let me back up a step here. In a sense, arguments come in four types. Some of them have all true premises and a true conclusion. Some of them have all true premises and a false conclusion. Some of them have at least one false premise and a true conclusion. Some of them have at least one false premise and a false conclusion. Let's look at some examples. Here's one with all true premises and a true conclusion. Some ducks have webbed feet. Some animals have webbed feet. Some animals are ducks. It's true that some ducks have webbed feet. It's true that some animals have webbed feet, specifically ducks. And some animals are ducks. All true premises and a false conclusion. Here's one. Some ducks can fly. Some airplanes can fly. Some airplanes are ducks. We've seen this one before. Some ducks can fly. Some airplanes can fly. But it's not true that some airplanes are ducks. So here's an argument with true premises and a false conclusion. Here's one with at least one false premise and a true conclusion. Some ducks are millionaires. some regular elevator riders are millionaires. Conclusion, some regular elevator riders are ducks. Now, are some ducks millionaires? No, only in Disney cartoons. Right? All right, maybe there's someone out there who's given $1 million to their pet duck in their will. I don't know. I'm hoping that's not true. Okay. But let's assume that no ducks are millionaires. Are some regular elevator riders millionaires? Yes, right? Lots of these millionaires work in tall buildings in big cities, so they ride elevators all the time. Are some regular elevator riders ducks? Why, yes, in fact, the ducks at the Peabody Hotel in Memphis are regular elevator riders. Every morning they get up, someone herds them into the elevator, they go into the elevator, it goes down to the first floor, the elevator opens, they roll out the red carpet, and the ducks waddle on over to the fountain, jump in, and start swimming. It's really fun to watch, especially fun for little kids. Okay, so yes, the Peabody ducks are regular elevator riders. So we've got at least one false premise. Right? It's not true that some ducks are millionaires. And we've got a true conclusion. Now here's one with at least one false premise and a false conclusion. Some ducks can fly, some millionaires can fly, therefore some millionaires are ducks. Can some ducks fly? Yes, a healthy duck is able to fly. Can some millionaires fly? No, and I mean like superhero style, right? Or with wings. I'm not talking about airplanes. You know what I meant. Right? So one of the premises is false. It's not true that some millionaires can fly. And the conclusion is false. As far as I know, no millionaires are ducks. So this claims some millionaires are ducks. That's not true. So we've seen that arguments can be in any of these categories. An argument can have all true premises and a true conclusion, all true premises and a false conclusion, at least one false premise and a true conclusion, at least one false premise and a false conclusion. Now this brings us back to argument forms. Most argument forms have instances in all four categories. Note that all of our previous arguments, or at least the four that we just looked at, had the same form. This form is known as III-2. Arguments with instances in all four categories are invalid. An invalid argument form is an argument form with at least one instance with all true premises and a false conclusion. Let's look at that again real quick. These arguments had the form III-2, which is some P are M, some S are M, some S are P. Now you'll notice it's the same structure on the right side. You see the M there. Well, all three of them start with some. All of them end with, the first two end with the same thing, have webbed feet, have webbed feet, have webbed feet. Just like on the left, you have P at the beginning of the first premise and P at the end of the conclusion. You've got ducks at the beginning of the first sentence and ducks at the end of the conclusion. You have animals at the beginning of the second premise, and you have animals at the beginning of the conclusion. So, right, this represents that form. And if you look through, you're going to see carefully, you're going to see the same thing here, right? Fly and fly at the end of this sentence, ducks at the beginning, ducks at the very end, airplanes there on the left in the second premise, and in the conclusion, etc. I'm not going to go through it in detail. You can look back at the earlier ones if you want. All four, the key point is all four of them have the same argument form, right? Which means that this argument form has instances in all four categories. In particular, it has ones with true premises and a false conclusion, and that makes it invalid. Now, at this point, remember that we're talking about true and false arguments. That is, we are talking about whether or not it is the case that all of the premises and the conclusion are true. So far, what we have seen is that invalid arguments can go either way. They can have all true premises and a true conclusion, or they can have at least one false statement, either one of the premises or the conclusion, or both. Now, in contrast, if an argument form is valid, then none of its instances have true premises and a false conclusion. However, they could fall into any other category. True premises and a true conclusion, false premises and a true conclusion, false premises and a false conclusion. Let me give you an example. This is a form we've seen in other videos. A and B, therefore A. Okay. This is a valid argument form. Okay. A and B basically says this first thing is true and this second thing is true, and then it draws the conclusion the first thing is true. Well, that's what and means. And is a way of saying both of these things are true. Okay. So there's no way you could have A and B be true and then A be false. So let's look at an instance. George Washington is dead and Martha Washington is dead. Therefore, George Washington is dead. True premise, true conclusion. Is the premise true? George Washington is dead and Martha Washington is dead? Yeah, they've both been dead for a couple centuries now. Is the conclusion true? Yes, George Washington is dead. Now here's an instance of that argument form with a false premise and true conclusion. George Washington is dead and Martha Washington is alive. Is that true? No, it's not. Martha Washington is dead. So the claim that both of these things is true, that's false. But is the conclusion true? Yes. In fact, George Washington is dead. Let's try another one. George Washington is alive and Martha Washington is alive. Is that a false premise? Yes. Right? Both of things are false. Both of those things are false, so they can't. So A and B can't be true. Is George Washington alive? No. So the conclusion is false. So as we've seen, here's an argument form. It's valid. It has at least one instance with true premise and true conclusion. We've seen an instance with a false premise and true conclusion, and an instance with a false premise and a false conclusion. The key point is that because it's valid, it can't have that other an instance in that other category. It can't have an instance with a true premise and a false conclusion. Okay. Now the implication here is this. Valid arguments could be true arguments and they could be false arguments. Okay. So, right, let me say a little more about that. Valid arguments could be true arguments and they could be false arguments. Right? That is, they could be true arguments. They could have true premises and a true conclusion. But they could also have false premises, right? And then either a false premise or a false conclusion, in which case not all the statements involved are true and they're false arguments. So where does this lead us? Well, here's the relationship between valid arguments and true arguments. Valid arguments can have all true premises and a true conclusion. Invalid arguments can have all true premises and a true conclusion. Valid arguments can have at least one false premise or conclusion. Invalid arguments can have at least one false premise or conclusion. Valid arguments can be true or false. Invalid arguments can be true or false. There's no definite relationship between these things. So if you see a valid argument, you can't conclude anything about whether it's true or false. Same thing with invalid arguments. Also, if you see an argument that's true, you can't conclude anything about whether it's valid. And if you see an argument that's false, you can't conclude anything about whether or not it's invalid. Now this brings us around to our other question. What about valid arguments and true statements? There is a very weak relationship between validity and the truth or falsehood of the statements. If an argument is valid, then it does not have both true premises and a false conclusion. So validity rules out one very specific combination. It rules out the possibility that the argument has all true premises and a false conclusion. But it doesn't rule out the possibility that the premises are true. It rules out the possibility that the premises are all true and the conclusion is false, but it could still be the case that the premises are all true. It also doesn't rule out the possibility that the conclusion is false. Okay. It's still possible that it has a false conclusion. It can't have a false conclusion and all true premises, but it could have a false conclusion and at least one false premise. So let me give you some examples here. Here is a valid argument with true premises. It's one we've seen before. George Washington is dead and Martha Washington is dead. Therefore, George Washington is dead. We've got a valid argument with all true premises. Here's a valid argument with a false conclusion. George Washington is alive and Martha Washington is alive. Therefore, George Washington is alive. Right? Well, they're both dead, so that premise is false. The conclusion is also false. So as we've seen, you can have valid arguments with true premises, you can have valid arguments with false conclusions. You can have valid arguments also with false premises and with true conclusions. The one thing you can't have is a valid argument that has both all true premises and a false conclusion. Now, if we turn to invalid arguments can have any possible combination of premises and conclusion. Invalid arguments can have all true premises and a true conclusion. They can have all true premises and a false conclusion. Invalid arguments can have at least one false premise and a true conclusion. They can have at least one false premise and a false conclusion. So invalid arguments can have any combination. Now, at this point, some people will give an objection. Wait a minute, don't invalid arguments have true premises and a false conclusion? The answer is no. Invalid arguments do not necessarily have true premises and a false conclusion. Why? For the following reason. An argument is invalid if at least one argument with the same form has true premises and a false conclusion. But not necessarily the argument itself. Okay? If an argument is invalid, that means that it has at least one argument with the same form has true premises and a false conclusion. It could be that argument itself, but it could be some other argument with the same form. So let me give you an example. Here's some examples involving invalid arguments. Let's go back to one of our examples from III-2. As we said, that is an invalid argument form. Now, here was one of the instances we gave of III-2. Some ducks have webbed feet, some animals have webbed feet, therefore some animals are ducks. Now notice, this has true premises and a true conclusion. Some ducks have webbed feet, some animals have webbed feet, some animals are ducks. So you might be asking, what makes it invalid? What makes it invalid is the fact that some other argument with the same form has true premises and a false conclusion, such as this one. Some ducks can fly, some airplanes can fly, some airplanes are ducks. As we saw, this has true premises and a false conclusion. So if we look at our first argument, it's an invalid argument, but that doesn't mean that this argument has true premises and a false conclusion. It means that at least one argument with the same form has true premises and a false conclusion. Could be this one, it could be another one, right? We don't know just from the fact that the argument is invalid that this happens to be one of the instances with true premises and a false conclusion. So the implication is this. When you figure out that an argument is invalid, then you do not yet know whether it is one of the instances with true premises and a false conclusion. It could be one of those instances that's actually a true argument. What you have to do is actually look at the premises and conclusion to figure it out. Okay? And in fact, on some of the writing assignments, you'll be given an argument and you'll use a technique to prove that it's invalid. Now, once you've proven that it's invalid, you can say, okay, we know it's invalid, so we really don't know anything about the truth of the premises or the conclusion. We're going to have to evaluate each premise and the conclusion to figure out which ones are true and which ones are false. So, in summary, the fact that an argument is invalid tells us nothing about the truth of the premises, tells us nothing about the truth of the conclusion, leaves every combination open. Every combination of true premises, false conclusion open. The fact that an argument is valid tells us nothing about the truth of the premises and tells us nothing about the truth of the conclusion, but it does rule out one combination, all true premises and a false conclusion. Now let's look at this going in the other direction. The fact that an argument has true premises and a false conclusion tells us that the argument is invalid. In fact, it also tells us that every argument with that form is invalid. No other combination tells us anything. The fact that an argument has true premises and a true conclusion tells us nothing. The fact that it has an argument with that it's an argument with false premises and a true conclusion tells us nothing. The fact that the argument has false premises and a false conclusion tells us nothing. Right? When we're moving in this direction, the fact that an argument has true premises and a false conclusion tells us that the argument is invalid, its form is invalid, and every other instance of that argument form is invalid. Nothing else proves anything. So bottom line, the fact that an argument is valid rules out the possibility that the argument has true premises and a false conclusion. The fact that an argument has true premises and a false conclusion proves two things. The argument itself is invalid, and every argument with the same form is invalid. Nothing else proves anything. And now I have to end with a vocabulary quirk. In this class, true premises almost always means all the premises are true. False premises almost always means at least one of the premises is false. The reason for this is the following. It really doesn't make any difference if you have an argument with 10 true premises and one false premise. Well, if the argument depends on all the premises to get the conclusion, one false premise makes it useless. Right? So we really don't care about whether or not it has a combination of true and false premises. What we're really interested in is the question, are all the premises true? So if we say true premise in the singular, we're usually talking about one premise. But if we use it in the plural, true premises almost always means all the premises are true. False premises almost always means at least one of the premises is false. If you have any questions about this, please let me know.